it can be really hard to quantify the extent to which biodiversity can, is important for human systems. And even harder is to quantify the ethical implications of human-caused extinctions on organisms that have been around for millions of years, to be around for millions more without our interventions. So another important thing that I know that a lot of you often don't think about is carbon sequestration. And this is incredibly, people often think about the fact that forests are important for carbon sequestration, and forest restoration is something that we think and talk a lot about when we're thinking about it. And it's true that younger forests are less good at sequestering carbon. Older forests have a much more efficient way of storing carbon. But also, many papers have been coming out recently thinking about this idea that and pointing out the fact that all components of biodiversity are in fact really important for carbon sequestration. So all components of the ecological system, including many of the larger plants, larger animals, and even small animals, are important for maintaining the landscapes that we see around us and affecting the efficiency and efficacy of the ecosystems that are then in turn sequestering carbon. In addition, they directly can affect carbon through changes in albedo and direct carbon sequestration. So all components of biodiversity are in fact very important for carbon sequestration.
Would it slow you down too much if I asked you to walk through the that I pointed out?
I can try too. It's not my paper, but
we can't wait for your paper.
I don't have a paper on this. Yeah. So, but yeah. So one of the things that animals are able to do is manage the ecosystem in ways that. So here, what we're talking about is, yeah, I'm sure, managing the direction and impact of the nutrient cycling and managing the plants themselves. So like as wildebeests go through and start to graze the plants, it increases the productivity of the plants, therefore increasing the growth and carbon sequestration that happens in each of the plants. That's this section. You have magnitude and direction impact of bioregimes. So both plants and animals, higher biodiversity of plants and animals can directly affect the extent to which fires are able to travel. And having an increase in animal biodiversity can cause an increase in plant biodiversity, direct impact on increase in plant biodiversity, which can mitigate fires. And then you have direct carbon sequestration through changes in albedo. And this is things like, maintaining large herds of elk on the what's the word? Tundra. Yeah, can cause direct changes in albedo, in fact. So
how's that?
Well, because they're dark in color, right? So they in fact can and extensive, like huge in volume. So they have actually been shown to have measurable effects on albedo and interest.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we all know that climate change is accelerating, and this is a major challenge for biodiversity of life on the planet. Simultaneously, the human footprint is expanding. So this is a picture of Las Vegas, and it's from 1984 until the present. And you can see the extent to which it is expanding, and the lake is contracting simultaneously. And so, and in fact, this is a picture that shows global human modification on terrestrial systems. 51% of terrestrial lands have been converted directly converted by humans, and 75% of landscapes are impacted by humans. So there's numbers range from 75 to 95%, depending on what you mean by impacted. So climate and anthropogenic changes, they interact in these really complex ways to yield dynamic global changes in biodiversity. And these can be kind of hard to measure and evaluate. So today I'm going to talk about some conservation approaches that have been developing over the last couple of decades for in order to try to conserve biodiversity in the face of these global dynamics. And then I'm going to talk about how we use the past to inform these types of conservation approaches, because it's incredibly important, and it can be incredibly hard to understand the underlying the ecological underpinnings to the conservation approaches. So I'll start off with conservation approaches. So when we're thinking about these complex dynamics, we anticipate that as climate is changing, species are going to need to shift their ranges in order to track those changes in climate. So here, this is a map that was made by Nature Conservancy, and it shows the centroid of the ranges of different species, amphibians in yellow, mammals in pink, and birds in blue, and how those centroids would need to shift on the landscape if they were to track projected. And the reality is that the conservation strategies are slowly beginning to shift away from some of these more static approaches. These are approaches like maintaining reserves or focusing on individual species for conservation. And these types of approaches are aimed toward maintaining biodiversity in situ and really thinking about kind of the status quo. And they're important, don't get me wrong, but they're in fact starting to be supplemented by approaches that are considering the fact that things aren't remaining static, ecosystems, species ranges aren't remaining static, and in fact are dynamically shifting in response to changing climates. And one of the things that I've worked on is thinking about the fact that, this movement, this needed movement, is likely going to be impeded by anthropogenic landscapes. And so this is just a depiction of some of the anthropogenic landscape types, like agriculture, roads, fences that prevent certain species from being able to shift or move along the landscape. And so one of the questions that we think about is the extent to which this type of climate tracking is possible. So I set out several years ago to address this question: where is human land use, in fact, limiting species' abilities to move or shift in response to projected warming? And to do this, I asked the question, what is the climate connectivity of natural land areas throughout the contiguous United States? So, and climate connectivity is defined as the degree to which landscapes and ecosystems are interconnected and able to support movement of plant and animal species in response to changing climates. So if we were to look at one of these natural land areas, so this is a map of kind of the remaining natural land areas across North America. We're being quite liberal here with what we're calling a natural land area. But if something were living in one of these natural land areas, what is how much could it shift across contiguous natural land areas in order to track changing climates? So what's the coldest temperature that something living in this spot could reach? And the answer is, on average, things can shift about 2 degrees Celsius. Right, so this is a map that shows the amount of shift that could happen, potential temperature change that could happen if something were to shift across the landscape and move from warmer to colder temperatures. But is this sufficient for things to actually outrun projected climate change? And you can see that it's darker in the west, it's paler in the east. So can things actually shift far enough? And the answer is that, if things are moving through adjacent natural areas, approximately 41% of those areas are places where things could achieve climate connectivity. So areas in blue colors are ones where you could achieve climate connectivity. Areas in more redder and in yellow areas are places where they would fail at being able to track climate. We then said, okay, what would happen if human land use weren't an issue? What would happen if we had connectivity between some of these different relatively natural land areas? So if movement could in fact occur across some of these areas, we created this map, this network of climate gradient corridors. These are the most efficient connectivity areas given climate gradients and temperatures across the contiguous United States. And we found that if things were able to move across these areas, 65% of natural areas could then achieve climate connectivity with the facilitation of these landscape corridors. So what this means is that human impacts are in fact preventing climate connectivity in 25% of these natural land areas. And so the areas that are blue are areas where things could in fact successfully track climate. Areas in red are only if they have additional connectivity, and gray areas are places that don't succeed because of the fact that climate gradients are such that they're just too far to move, or you don't have the appropriate connectivity. So climate connectivity is in fact a part of the new regime of these dynamic conservation strategies that are being developed. And in fact, that paper has been used to identify connectivity strategies for the Eastern United States. So this is kind of this aspirational map that was created by this Wildlands Network in 2019 based on this map. And it's obviously we will never achieve this much landscape connectivity across the Eastern US, but it's something that it's intended to try to encourage conservation organizations to try to achieve some increase in connectivity, especially in the Eastern United States where it's most critical. Some of the latest strategies being produced by the Nature Conservancy are in fact identifying regions across the contiguous United States that provide both resilient and connected networks of sites that are going to be able to make sustained biodiversity under a changing climate. And this is still in the same regime. The idea here is that you can identify areas that will be, at least in the short term, resilient to climate change. This means that it has, there are landscapes that typically have high heterogeneity. So there's a lot of different microclimates that are present within them. And then, and so things can shift locally in order to adapt to changing climates. But then once the capacity of that area is exceeded, you then need to allow them to move further afield to different temperatures, more different temperatures, in order to track those changing climates. And so that's this network that they're putting together, and they're using this in their prioritization strategies for identifying places to make land purchases and land easements.
So how is the resilient piece of resilient and connected network defined?
Yeah, so here when they're talking about resilience, what they're talking about is identifying kind of climate refugia. And that's what I was talking about, that these resilient landscapes is what they're calling them. These are areas that are very heterogeneous, very diverse in their landscape, and they allow things to be resilient to climate change by only moving. So that's what they're calling resilient. So it's like climate resilience because of the fact that things are able to adjust locally. So I'm going to shift now to thinking about how these types of strategies are informed by using the past as a lens for biodiversity conservation. So going back again to this figure, which I obviously love and put in a few too many times here, but
it's a bit psychedelic.
Yeah, we anticipate that these species are in fact going to shift their ranges to adapt to climate change. But the reality is that we don't, in fact, yet know the extent to which different individual species indeed track climate. And in fact, plants and animals thus far have tracked climate far less than predicted based on just the climates in which they live. So this is a figure from a paper, a meta-analysis that recently came out that shows that amphibians, in fact, have moved the wrong way, the opposite way of what I've expected. birds, fish, insects, mammals have moved, but not nearly as much as you would anticipate that they would have needed to move given climate change that's already occurred. And then the two taxa that you see up here that have moved significantly are polychaetes and spiders. So, that things are moving actually considerably less than we anticipate. And the question is why, right? So is it because things really don't track climate, or is it because of the fact that they're impeded in their ability to track climate because of the fact that we've had so much landscape modification? So one of the challenges for understanding,
they're more resilient to it in the first place.
or they have more, yeah, that's right. So or they have more flexibility than we realized, right? Yeah. So some of the challenges to understanding these range dynamics are the fact that they occur over really large spatial scales. You have really rapid climate change occurring, and you have really rapid land use change that's happening. And so it can be really hard to identify sufficient effect size when you're looking over like 5 to 10 to 15-year periods because of the fact that these things are happening on such a large spatiotemporal scale. But the reality is that climate change and land availability have both changed significantly through time. So here you can see, though not as rapidly as recently, of course, but here you can see the Pleistocene climate temperature curve over the last 8,000 years, and then you can see the extent of the last glacial maximum, which was 21,000 years ago, where large portions of North America were in fact unavailable for things to inhabit. And until recently, it's been a little challenging to be able to study the direct effects of these kinds of environmental change because of the fact that maybe we have the biodiversity, but we don't necessarily have the detail of some of these temperature changes. But the reality now is that global circulation models have been used to reconstruct paleoclimates, and we actually have a lot of global reconstructions of past climates that we can use in concert with biological data in order to understand how things have responded to past change. So conservation paleontology, which is, I would say, a budding field, but it's a couple decades old also, is a big data field at this point. So this is one of several databases. This one covers the last several tens of thousands of years, maybe 100,000 years. And you can see that it has almost 11 million data points of fossil occurrences from globally. It originated in North America, so North America is in fact the most strongly covered. And this is from 19,000 sites, again, globally. And these different colors represent different types of data. So green are pollen data, blue are vertebrates, pink are invertebrates, terrestrial invertebrates, and purple are other data types, which I'd be happy to talk about at some point. But huge data. And integrating fossils and spatial data can in fact be a really powerful approach if done appropriately. So in February of this year, we pulled together a special feature called "The Past as a Lens for Biodiversity Conservation on a Dynamically Changing Planet," and this was edited by myself, Michelle Lyne, who's at Texas A&M, Niels Christian Stenseth, and Sandra Diaz, who are the international National Academy members who are co-editors along with us and started this issue. And the special feature explored strategies for identifying how to conserve for dynamic resilience and to inform how do we inform these strategies using conservation paleontology. And these are all of the authors that contributed to the special feature. One of the things that we contributed goes back to this question of why are things not moving as much as we expect? And so what we looked at was, did plants in fact previously track climate as it changed? We see that they're not tracking it as much as we expect right now yet, but we wanted to know, if they,
That's for me.
but do we in fact know whether or not they previously had tracked? And this was inspired and co-produced with the Nature Conservancy in their work looking at resilient and connected landscapes, because they're interested in trying to figure out what are the, how to most effectively think about these connected landscapes. So in order to do this, we used the remarkable record of pollen communities from across North America. And so here you can see our data points. This is 358 pollen cores, and I doubt many of you know what these look like, but each one of these points is a core of sediment. So it's, a vertical core of sediment. And then each of these red lines represents a sample that would be taken out of that core of sediment. So, the bottom part of this core is the past, the top is the present. And we looked at 20,000 years ago until recent times. And what you can do with these pollen samples is you can actually, so this is what each one of the pollen samples might look like. Here, granules of pollen. And you can actually reconstruct the relative abundance of the different plant species that were living at that site through time.
Ask something.
Yeah.
So I, of course, have heard of ice cores. So this is the first time that I've heard about like pollen cores. What are other things that
exist in cores? Yeah. So there are also invertebrates. So we use like lakes. In lakes, we look at like diatoms and things like that. We also do isotope geochemistry on the soil itself and can look at local climate using stable isotope geochemistry on the actual climate. And then I guess we use cores frequently for dating as well, but it's just some integration. Oh, I guess another thing is fire history. So charcoal, and you do typically when you do pollen cores, you also do charcoal flows along with the pollen extraction, so that you can look at the relative amount of charcoal that's present. So a lot of information you can get from these, and most of them are present in these databases. But they do have to be standardized in certain ways, which is we standardized all the dates across all these cores as a first step for all of the subsequent work you'll see. So that's all now publicly available. Yeah. So one of the things that we already knew from the pollen core, and you'll notice this only in the eastern United States because the western part had not yet been standardized, is the fact that biomes have shifted across the landscape. These are past reconstructions as climate has changed. As you can see on this bottom graph, this is temperature change over the last 20,000 years. But what we didn't know, we didn't have a sense of what is the frequency of turnover or of change of ecosystems or of biomes over time. And so, using these data, one of the things that we looked at was how frequently do plant biomes transition over those 20,000 years. And here on the right, you can see a figure of transitions of things like deciduous forest to coniferous forest to boreal forest. So how do the plant biomes, in fact, transition over the last 20,000 years? And we found that like North American biomes transition every 460 years. And I think, to me, that seemed way more frequently than I was anticipating. And so forests will turn over and become a different plant biome. So like a deciduous forest will become a coniferous forest, or a deciduous forest will become a prairie every 700 years on average. And grasses and shrublands will change to another type of biome every 340 years on average. And so we should anticipate that plants are going to change and turn over relatively frequently, especially as you see climate changing. So this, of course, increased in frequency, turnovers increased as you had increases in temperature. So as soon as we hit 0.5 degrees Celsius change per 500 years, we suddenly had a transition to much more rapid plant biome transitions. So we were wondering whether these transitions, in fact, were because plants were maintaining what we call climate fidelity over this time period. So we were wondering whether these movements are, in fact, species tracking their preferred climates as those climates were changing, or if they were in response to other types of things. Like, as the glaciers retreating, there's just more space, right? So maybe it's just that. Maybe it's just filling in of space. Or maybe it's a response to interspecific interactions. You have a pest come in, and therefore the range of the tree contracts because of the fact that you have a pest that's killing the whole southern limit of that tree, right? So we're wanting to know to what extent do these plants maintain climate fidelity over the past 18,000 years. And to do this, we looked at the extent to which these climates kind of overlapped across these different time periods. So high climate fidelity would be high overlap, despite the fact that climate was changing. Low would be low overlap, despite the fact that climate was changing. And here's what it looks like when we're looking at kind of two different time periods. The dark purple is the older time period. The brighter purple is a younger time period, and the overlap is here in turquoise. So this is a 0.4 overlap, which is a relatively low overlap. And here's an example looking at ash of the different time periods that we looked at. So these would be two transition periods, and we did time steps to see how much overlap you had from time step 1 to time step 2, time step 2 to time step 3, right? And so when we looked at it, we found that on average, the climate overlap from time step to time step is 65%. This is quite high. And in fact, 86% of cases, this is statistically significantly more overlap than you would expect based on random due to how the background climate has shifted across the landscape, has changed in North America over time. So in most cases, plants are in fact, as they're shifting their ranges, they're in fact maintaining climate fidelity, maintaining the same climatic niches through time. We then took this and looked at the communities of species, and we said, okay, where are plants that have maintained this really high climate fidelity, that have always had really high overlapping climate? Where are they living across North America? And it's a little hard to see because it's so coarse, but especially some of these plants that are living in the northern parts of North America are maintaining really high climate fidelity. These communities, in fact, are maintaining really high climate fidelity over time. So these are plants that are going to, in fact, need to continue to track climate in order to survive over time. So most plants are shifting their ranges dynamically and tracking changing climates. But to what extent are species on the landscape being impeded by human impacted landscape? And this is a study that we did that looked at mammals instead of plants, because mammals have a little bit more of an obvious connection to landscape impediments based on anthropogenic landscape change, and also homologists looking at it. So yeah. So this was led by my postdoc, Sylvia Pineda Munoz. I had her picture up, but I forgot to mention the previous study was led by Yue Wang, who's a postdoc, a previous postdoc also. So we asked also, have the climates occupied by mammals been altered by human impacted landscapes? So again, we used fossil data to identify the climates where different species were living. Here's an example of the American bison. So each of these are occurrence points of where they've lived through time. We reconstructed the climates that they lived in across these different time periods. The bottom is the present, the top is the past. You can see that bison have a smaller distribution, a smaller range today than they used to in the past. And in doing so, we wanted to see whether we did this for 46 different mammal species, and we wanted to see whether or not there had been some kind of shift in their climates where they lived across these different time periods. So for this, we compared from each time period to the present, and we wanted to know whether or not there had been a shift between these different time periods. And what we found was that this oldest time period and the present time period has only a 35% overlap in climate on average. So 67% of the mammals that we looked at shifted the climates where they were living. And the majority of these did that around the times that Europeans arrived on the landscape. We then compared the climates that we wanted to know whether or not that their climates that they were shifting away from, or in some cases into, were ones that are occupied by urban or cropland areas. So we reconstructed the climates of the urban and cropland areas, and we said, okay, are things moving into those areas or away from those areas? And a little surprisingly, we found that some mammals were shifting the climates they were living in away from more temperate areas into areas that were colder and less hospitable in many ways. And these are typically larger animals like pumas or bison or bears. And a lot of small species were actually expanding the climate zones that they were living in into areas of human occupation. And you can kind of imagine this happening when you look out your backyard and see your squirrels. But the reality is that, urban areas provide, again, a lot of microclimates and microhabitats where little things can kind of survive and thrive, despite the fact that it might have previously been not as tolerable.
Like my attic.
Like your attic, exactly. So mammals with low human tolerance are in fact going to need extra help in order to track changing climates when they need to track changing climates. And the plants and animals are going to need help shifting their distributions in response to these changing climates. So these types of strategies that promote movement, that allow things to dynamically shift in response to climate change are things that are going to be important going forward. But we now have a better refinement of which taxa are in fact most affected by these types of changes and are most resistant to shifting across anthropogenic impacted landscapes. What are the implications for this locally? Well, locally, urban planning has been thinking a lot about connectivity because it has not only implications for climate change, it also has implications for allowing different species to survive and different populations to interact and interbreed with one another. And so this is a map that came out of Atlanta City Design, the plan to protect, restore, and accentuate urban ecology in Atlanta. And it's pointing out the fact that regionally there is some level of connectivity and some level of habitat connectivity. And within Atlanta itself, there is, in fact, a plan for increasing connectivity among some of the regions of high ecological value. The challenge here, that being said, this hasn't been implemented, right? So this is something that's kind of high in the sky. And one of the challenges is always working across boundaries. So as soon as you move out of Atlanta and try to connect up this landscape with this landscape, you start to have challenges, especially bureaucratic and whatever political challenges. So when we're thinking about conserving the fabric of life, given the complexities of global change, the things that we are working to do is identify climate-sensitive taxa, identify anthropogenically vulnerable taxa, and then facilitate and promote natural responses to changing climates. Some of the stuff that we're working on going forward, locally, we have plans to expand some biodiversity surveys and some of the models that we've been looking on a broader scale, bringing them to a more local scale. And I'm going to highlight work that Ben, who's here, did in Stone Mountain, looking at doing camera trapping there and looking at some of the biodiversity. And the reality is that a lot of these parks that we have within Atlanta, because we are such a green city and anyway, possess a huge biodiversity of taxa. So these are all camera trap photos that have been taken at Stone Mountain by our group, by Ben, looking at, we've got white-tailed deer, coyotes, boar, flying squirrels, possums, armadillos, river otters, and beavers all captured on our camera traps. And bird diversity as well. Here, hawks, two hawks, great blue heron, mockingbird, barred owl. So we're really interested in looking at how some of the the island aspect of how some of these different reserves are maintaining biodiversity and the extent to which connectivity can facilitate their survival and survive and survival and thriving of these different taxa. More broadly, what do we still not know in terms of climate fidelity? Well, we haven't actually looked at the extent to which mammals exhibit climate fidelity. We see a hint that they don't care as much about climate as plants. And so we're looking at that. We're also looking at the extent to which there's a trophic cascade. So whether or not mammals are more dependent on the plants, which are then more dependent on the climate, versus just being directly impacted by climate. And also thinking about what traits confer climate fidelity that allow plants and or animals to track climate across the landscape and or seascape over time. We've also, with respect to some of the conservation questions we work on, we've been thinking about how to integrate species vulnerabilities with spatial modeling in order to create effective conservation prioritization. This is work that started with collaboration with Mr. Delpina, who used to be here, but is now at USC. And Ben took this on and created an R package called Mega SDM, Species Distribution Modeling. That is a strategy for trying to predict how and where species are going to move through time and where there might be issues with connectivity given the heterogeneity of climate change through time. And so with that, I'll stop. If anyone's interested in learning about more of the papers that are in the special feature, I have a thread on Twitter and or Mastodon about each of the papers, explaining what each of the papers and their major findings.
Any questions from the audience? So I have, yeah.
Sorry, maybe you covered this when I was out, but is there any evidence that these plants or animals are adapting to climate change and that they're going to stay there, but they're going to be different in some way? I don't know, buffalo that can have thinner skin and tolerate heat or something. I don't know.
Yeah, so there's some evidence that certain taxa. Well, there's so many different ways to answer this. So there's a couple of things. One is that the climates in which things are living today, as you saw, aren't the climates that they lived in the past. And this is partly because of the fact that humans have, kind of pushed them out of some of those climates. And the reality is that we don't fully understand all of the climates in which things have the capability to live. This isn't adaptation. This is just, they actually could live in a broader set of climates than we realize. So there's many different directions of projects that are out there that are looking at this. One of which is looking at what's called the fundamental niche of a species, and this is the set of environmental conditions in which something can live, which is slightly different, which is often different than the set of environmental conditions in which they do live. As far as adaptation goes, there's several different mechanisms of adaptation. And actually, we're working on two papers that we just visioned at a workshop recently of looking at, how can you look at and think about the species that stay in situ, right? What are in situ potential for adaptation? And the answer to that is that they already have standing, they already have the potential to exhibit phenotypic plasticity. And what that means is that maybe a behavioral change. So maybe something like a flower begins, it flowers earlier because of the fact that spring comes sooner. Right. And this is something that, can be kind of standing variation within the population, but often that gets kind of passed from generation to generation because of the fact that it's about how their standing DNA, their DNA is actually expressed rather than whether or not they are actually going to shift the frequency of their genetic predisposition for things. The other thing that you can look at to try to get a sense of evolvability or the ability to adapt or evolve in situ is the standing phenotypic variation. So that means the variation of traits that are present within a species, which can be very hard to get at, right? So sometimes there's that one individual that's able to that has thinner skin, or there's 10 individuals, or that one population. And maybe this is one that's going to then succeed well and interbreed with other things. But those can be very hard to identify and find, right? Because of the fact that they often occur in low numbers. And so we've been thinking about what are proxies for standing variation that could exist within historical records. So thinking about whether or not there's a high level of variation in a trait that's useful, like let's say thin skin, amongst the sister species of those taxa, right? And if you think that other closely related species do have that variation, then maybe other species that are closely related might be able to have that. But it's a hard thing to recognize. And one of the things that I did point out is that plants and animals have not been moving as fast as we think that they should. So they haven't been moving up in elevation, and they've been moving, shifting their latitudes, but not as fast as we think they need to in order to adapt to climate change. And the question there is there just a lag, which is very possible because it takes time, right? It just takes time to have babies and have them mature and have them realize they need to move. But also maybe human impacts on the landscape are impeding some of that movement, and teasing all that apart can be really challenging. It's some of the stuff that we're trying to think about. So a complex question. That being said, entirely having a bison entirely adapt something that does not exist as standing variation within the populations is unlikely. It would mean having a new type of mutation that then actually has function, and that then actually has a useful function. It can happen, but something that's as slow at reproducing as a bison, it would be very unlikely for it to happen, right? If we were talking about bacteria, sure, maybe eventually they're reproducing quickly, and there's so much mutation that's happening that eventually it falls on one that's useful, and it happens.
But is there evidence of that in the fast reproducing species?
Yes, so things especially that affect fecundity or that affect their ability to reproduce further, it can happen. And I mean, you see this in viruses, shifting and evolving over time. You see it, but reproductive rate has a really high impact on the potential for novel mutations to take hold within the species.
In the general body of this work, are there people who connect the work to the communities living on the land and the connections of these shifts to cultural practices, or like the community aspect of this? I'm
Yes.
curious.
And in fact, one of the papers in our special feature looks at layering social and natural history knowledge in such a way that we can identify who are the right groups to ask about different types of biodiversity impact questions and things like that. So she's at Yale, and her name is Naima Harris.
What's that?
Naima Harris, and she's one of our authors in the special feature, and this is the paper that she published was looking at multiple layers, both social, economic, and biological layers, and integrating those in map systems in order to be able to identify how to be more effective with conservation questions. So maybe that's the type of question you're asking.
Well, so, yeah. I was curious, just because we're trying to build up the community engaged research support infrastructure here at Brook Byers Institute. So I was wondering if there's anyone at Georgia Tech who is doing this kind of work would also, would benefit from us doing that.
Yeah.
And my other question, which is along the same lines, is with this work, who are the specific, conservation organizations or actors that you're targeting, and how do you go about it? And again, is there something that as Brook Byers Institute we can help somehow support?
It's an interesting
the impact.
So
practice of your work.
There's two things. So I often am having conversations with large types of, sorry, I don't have everything turned off. Large types of organizations that are looking, on large spatial scales, like Nature Conservancy. I mentioned them several times. And I work pretty closely with them. I speak with them 2 to 3 times a year. And talk to them about some of the challenges they're facing and questions that they're asking. And usually there are other large organizations that I've worked with, like Wildlife Society and groups like that. And we've talked about connectivity challenges, and they're making similar sorts of strides and thinking about how to increase connectivity on the landscape. The fact that Atlanta is so actively thinking about these types of strategies for maintaining ecosystems and urban ecology, I don't know who the players are in that. It would be great to connect. I would actually be really excited about that. We have 1, maybe 2 new faculty members who are also naturalists who are going to be joining the faculty soon, one who's an ornithologist, and we'll see about the other one. So they accept, but and we're really excited about trying to expand the local, create a local program where we're looking at biodiversity and the history of biodiversity in the area, and how do we get back to historical biodiversity levels, that kind of thing. Those are
Anyways, we'll keep us in mind.
the local government type things.
Helpful, that kind of support.
If I put on my engineer hat and ask a really stupid question like an engineer would,
That's good.
Could I take your work and use it as a guide to, let's say that this part of the country is no longer good habitat for this flora or fauna or whatever lives there, but this other place you're now projecting would be a good environment for them to live in.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that there's so much fragmentation of the ecosystem between there and here that expecting them to migrate over time is hard to believe, or it's not going to happen, or there's so many barriers. Could I, as an engineer, pick that population up or some small part of it and repopulate this new area here and just create a whole new ecosystem that's engineered, but
you're asking about 2 concepts integrated. One is assisted migration, and the other is
I'm glad there's a name for it.
And the other is rewilding. So these are both things that are pretty hot topics in conservation. Rewilding is something that's hugely controversial. Assisted migration is slightly less controversial. So assisted migration is something that, is done and has been done. I wouldn't think, whole ecosystems are hard to restore, right? So things like facilitating the planting of certain seeds. One of the things that people worry a lot about is no analog types of communities, right? So if you're able to plant your pine tree over here, and it's never lived with this birch species before. What's the interaction going to be like? These are things that we've not experienced, at least in recent times. And actually, that's one of the things that having a paleo history is really nice for, because we've had no analog communities in the past, and we know what types of species have co-occurred before. And so there, many people who are really interested in trying to use past analogs to try to figure out what future analogs might look like. And I think this is a really good strategy for thinking about which combinations are ones that make sense. Because it's impossible to move an entire ecosystem, right? You can maybe move individual species, but an entire ecosystem is challenging. Rewilding is a concept that is a little bit more of an extreme version of that. So rewilding is something that's especially come up with respect to colonialism and Africa, and the fact that Africa is one of the remaining places, Africa and South Asia are one of some of the remaining places where we have large animals still living, still surviving. And the idea here is that we could, we used to have large animals living all over North America. And it's thought that humans, as we came in, some combination of climate change and humans existing on the landscape caused all of this, many of those large animals to go extinct, the majority. But the climates are still here, the habitats are still here. What happens if we bring a lion here, right? And that one is much more controversial for two reasons. And then we don't put the onus on our African nations to maintain all of these species, right? They're trying to develop as nations, and who are we to say, you have to conserve these species that are causing you challenges and whatever. So, the idea of bringing them to some portion of North America and allowing them to live or some other place, they're actually doing this in parts of Europe, is very popular, and there's certain people who are really pushing it. That it comes with all of its own challenges that you can imagine. We have the same, it's hard to have lions here also, right? So, and also we think about situations like Australia, where we're like, oh, these rabbits are being a real pain, so let's bring in something to control them, or let's bring in toads, right? And then it becomes overrun and species go extinct because of the fact that we've brought in non-marsupials into a world full of marsupials, and they're being outcompeted. So species aren't fully interchangeable, and having all these new species on the landscape could cause unintended consequences. And I think it's interesting and incredibly controversial, and something that's fun to talk about, think about. But I think the political reality is never going to happen.
No?
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about
except for maybe the hippos in Colombia, right? They're doing very well, right?
Yeah. I mean, if we're
so private investors may do it.
Geoengineering at such a large scale, we're going to fertilize the ocean to take up more carbon, or we're going to put sulfur particles in the stratosphere to reflect more sunlight. I mean, this rewilding seems tame in terms of
it does seem tame
intervention relative to that.
Relative to that, I agree.
Thanks for being here, everyone. Thank you. And thank you.
Yeah.
Very interesting work.